Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have over 500 people from all across the world joining us today. My name is Jamie Joshua. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University's S.C. Johnson College of Business. In order for the business landscape to change, we must learn to dialogue across difference and seek to understand and learn about our lived experiences and how they shape the decisions we make as leaders. Today's conversation on creating leadership through belonging is a fireside chat between Mark Nelson, the Ann and Elmer Linseth Dean and Professor of Accounting here at the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management, and Melissa C. Thomas Hunt, Head of Global Diversity and Belonging at Airbnb. Dean Mark Nelson has been the Dean of Johnson since 2016 and Professor of Accounting for 30 years. An award-winning teacher and researcher, Mark oversees Johnson's faculty and staff, as well as its MBA, EMBA, and MPS programs. And he also serves on the leadership team of the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. Melissa C. Thomas Hunt is the Head of Global Diversity and Belonging at Airbnb. In that role, she leads the strategy and execution of their global internal diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging programs. An expert on building inclusive global teams, Melissa joined Airbnb from Vanderbilt University, where she served as Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence. In that role, she was responsible for helping advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in Vanderbilt's academic research and community of students, faculty, and staff. Prior to her work at Vanderbilt, Melissa served as Global Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business, where she was focused on ensuring that the student community was seen, heard, valued, and supported. Prior to that role, she was a professor here at Johnson. It is wonderful to welcome Melissa home to the family for today's discussion. We are thrilled that she is sharing her thoughts with us today. We will start with some discussion and then leave time to ask questions for our panelists. We ask that you utilize the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Without further delay, I give the floor to Dean Nelson.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks for everything that you and ODI do for the school and the college. Melissa, I'm listening to this resume and I'm thinking to myself that one of the fun things about me having been here 30 years is that I knew people back in the day. So, I mean, I was thinking about you and Brian and the kids coming over to our house for make your own pizza night.
Yeah, and for pumpkin carving.
Indeed. And so then fast forward, and I'm meeting Michelle Duguid, who's on with us and who's our college's Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging, as you know. And I'm meeting her for the first time, and she says, "Oh, I know all about you."
only love and good things.
Well, Michelle and I are friends and colleagues, so it wasn't that much damage. And so here we are, all grown up, and you have this remarkable job with Airbnb. So what I would love, if you'd be willing to, is to just start off by walking us through a day, walking us through a week, your role at Airbnb. I mean, what are you spending your time on? What's most challenging?
Wow, that's a lot. We could have the whole conversation. So, up until May of 2019, I was fully ensconced in academia, as a faculty member, as an administrator, and had no aspirations or any sense that I would be on the corporate side more than doing exec ed. And then all of a sudden found myself not only on the corporate side, but on the executive team in the tech industry of a burgeoning company. And so I have to say, I was terrified in making that jump, because as faculty, we give lots of wisdom out there, and there's always this little gnawing sense of like, do we actually know how it plays out in the applied world? And so I was delighted to have the opportunity to try and move from academia to the applied. Airbnb has the reputation of moving things pretty quickly. We also have as our mission, creating a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And so much of the work that I had done in trying to create inclusion and advanced diversity was grounded in creating a sense of belonging across a wide array of faculty and students and staff members. And so to find an organization that actually had that as its mission was really compelling, and that was moving fast. And so I joined Airbnb at a moment when the CEO had just made 15 diversity and belonging commitments. And what I didn't know, I knew that he had made those commitments. What I didn't know until I joined was that they mostly had my name associated with them as the single owner. So, so that was fast paced. There were a host of them that I had to gather information, assemble, key people, so that we could figure out what the essence of the problem was and then move forward on it. The biggest of the commitments was that we would assemble a task force on diversity and belonging. And I had already started having conversations. I had decided that my role it's global, and it was really important for people outside of the US to understand that I was their person as well, and for me to understand the nature of differences in different places around the world and what got in the way of belonging. So I had lots of those conversations and realized that we didn't need an elaborate task force, that we needed to conduct a sprint. And so it was a 4-week sprint. It was largely grounded in our employee experience team, which is HR. And that's because we have learning and culture and recruiting and talent support systems all there, but then pulling in members of our employee resource groups and leaders and executives as we were gathering this information. And the point was to understand what are the things that we're actually doing well, and there were a lot of them, and then what were the opportunity areas, but at a really fine-grained nuance level, because there's often a disconnect between sort of the broad employee base and what the executive team perceives as being the state of affairs. And I had the unique opportunity to cascade both down and up. And so we created a report, we distilled it down to something that could be digested by all of our employees. We presented it in December to the executive team. And much to my delight, they raised their hands and they said, "You didn't ask us to make personal diversity and belonging commitments." And I said, "Well, I can do that." And so we infused that in. So all of our ET members have made a commitment that they're on their own personal learning journey. And we also wanted to put short-term goals in place. And so we created some Q1 2020 action steps. And we were well on our way to achieving all of those when, of course, we found out that we were in a pandemic and that we were pausing hiring. So at that point, there were two for Q1 that we hadn't achieved yet. One was that we, having just achieved our Q1 2020 URM underrepresented minority goals, we had committed that we were going to set goals for the end of 2020. But if you're not hiring, then you really can't set diversity goals, because it requires careful analysis of our people analytics teams for them to understand what availability is in the market and the headcount across the company. And so we had to pause that initiative. And then the second thing was that we had promised that we would deliver a diversity and belonging strategy, which was not meant to be a heavy lift. It was meant to roll out from our recommendations, but with prioritization. And because, we were a travel company, and in that moment, it seemed like the bottom of travel had fallen out, that it seemed like inappropriate to put forth a strategy when we didn't necessarily know where the company would be. I'm excited to say that fast forward, we've just released our diversity and belonging strategy. It has a fine point on 2020, but points to the future. And we've also made a commitment that we're going to set 2025 goals, and we've set some end of 2021 goals around our board and our executive team representation. So long-winded answer, but it gives you a sense of what my last 16 months have been like. Lots of conversations, understanding the nuances, bringing the theory in from my own scholarship and that of others, and then applying it, and really just getting a handle on how do organizations actually work? What are the processes? Interrogating those and figuring out how can we remove friction to advancing diversity and belonging.
You've done a huge amount in a short time, and with a pandemic thrown in to boot, right?
Yeah.
Remarkable. So, and I remember when I heard that you'd made this move, I thought I couldn't think of anybody better to be able
Oh,
well, but seriously, because you're an academic who is grounded in exactly what you would be applying here. And I know you've been a very effective executive teacher for a long time, so you'd had that interaction, but then you get to take that next step.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Thank you.
well, it's a heartfelt. So let me ask something that had occurred to me at the time, and that still intrigues me, and that is when we think about Airbnb, you have at least two fronts here to work on. One is what I would think is more conventional, and that is in the sense of dealing with the employees and the leadership of Airbnb itself. But you also have this extension of this vast network of hosts that are also needing to act appropriately, are potentially having implicit or explicit biases, and so have you been pulled into dealing with issues on the host front as well? And maybe, what's been relatively more or less effective?
Yeah. So I am not the first, I'm not the inaugural person in my role, although it was reconstituted and the commitment was made that it was going to be an executive team role as I came into it. The individual who had been the role before was in that role in the 2016-2017 timeframe. So for those of you who know, that was a period of time where it became there was greater awareness of the challenges that some of our guests were facing on the platform. To put a fine point on it more explicitly, that our Black guests were having a different experience than other guests on the platform. And so my predecessor spent a lot of time forging partnerships with civil rights organizations and actually moving us as a company forward to begin to mitigate some of those challenges. And Mark, you mentioned, there are unconscious biases, there's outright racism and sexism and a whole host of things that take place. And the reality is, we are a platform that brings people together, and people don't leave those things at home. They bring them onto the platform. I think the difference is that once it became elucidated to our founders, their standpoint was it's insufficient for us to say that we're just a platform, that we actually have to make sure that individuals are having an experience of connection and belonging, and that we're not doing anything to erode that. And I think, from their standpoint, founded by, 3 white men, and they have said this, they were excited about the opportunity to bring people together, but their own lived experiences hadn't given them the perspective to understand the differential way in which individuals might have been treated on the platform. And with that new knowledge, there were some things that got put into place. So one, there's a community commitment. So all guests and hosts need to sign the community commitment, and over 1 million people have been asked to leave the platform or not allowed to join as a function of their not being willing to sign the community commitment. There was also one of the ways in which differential treatment might have been manifest was by there was a requirement that you had to have a profile picture as a potential guest. And so that requirement has actually been removed now. So hosts, when they're making the determination to accept a guest who wants to make a booking, they actually don't see a picture of them at this particular point of view. We also have a dedicated anti-discrimination team that spends a lot of time thinking and doing research about how to mitigate all kinds of discrimination on our platform, which could range from the multiple dimensions of difference. So disability and being a member of the LGBTQI+ community, a host of other things. And then most recently, we have publicly announced our Project Lighthouse. which is an effort to really understand what the experiences of individuals on our platform, and through a mechanism of third parties who will be doing assessments of perceived race of our guests, and then we'll be looking historically to see what their treatment has been. We'll be able to understand what some of the friction points are on the platform, and then be to mitigate that. So that, so that latter portion I've been a part of. The former portion was actually in motion, and one of the things that pulled me and demonstrated the commitment of the company demonstrated the commitment of the company. And so in my current role, I am very internally focused, because what we hadn't done as we were paying attention to our guests and our hosts and the platform, we hadn't paid as much attention to our employees and the experience. And because we have a very well-known set of core values, any employee could recite them, the mission of belonging, people are drawn to the company because of an aspiration to create belonging. And for those individuals who come and were having experiences that may have eroded that belonging, that was particularly painful. And so we started on a journey of identifying differences in the way that our subgroups of our employees were experiencing our company. And then my role, along with my team, was to begin to figure out how do we mitigate those differences and gaps that exist.
That's so important. And so let me think more about that internal role. And when I think about what you're doing, and I think about different ways I've intersected in this space, again, it's a long career. We sort of started off talking about diversity, and then we would talk about inclusion and equity, and now we tend more to use the term belonging, and to say that we want to make sure that we're enhancing that sense of belonging for everyone in our organization. So help me understand how you would define belonging, and how that relates to diversity and inclusion and equity. How do you address that? How do you define it, and help me relate?
So we've spent some time thinking about that, and the way that I and the company define belonging is that, if you think of a given individual, that they are respected, that they are valued, and that they have an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution. I tend to think of it as that any given person can think of that organization, that space, as being their place, their space. And in fact, there's some research by Sophie Trewalter, who's at UVA at the Batten School, who's found that looking at undergraduates at UVA, that underrepresented minorities don't feel the same comfort in using some of the hallmark spaces at the university. And so to truly feel like you belong, it means that you feel comfortable throughout all of the sort of hallowed halls, but particularly the critical areas that are linked to the culture of whatever the organization actually is. When you think about, diversity is about like who is literally represented here. And, diversity has come to have some charge to it. People react to the word diversity. But the reality is that we all have dimensions of diversity. Some are visible, some are not. We have intersecting identities. And so when people talk about diverse people, like we're all diverse people. It's really like diversity is a characteristic of an aggregate. You can have a diverse group, right? But you don't have diverse people per se. And so when you think of it that way, you think about like, so who is represented here or who is not represented? From our local community, from our global population, are we reflective of that? And what I found, and this is, more what I found just from being a faculty member in classrooms, is the demographic composition of a classroom changes the conversation. It changes the dynamic. It changes the way that people engage with one another. I most often saw that in the gender dynamics in the business school classroom, that when you got to a certain percentage of having women as defined in the gender binary, that in fact, the conversation became often a little bit more civil, a little bit more collegial as a whole in aggregate. That's my anecdotal experience over, multiple classrooms and institutions. But so who is there actually matters in like how things feel. The inclusion piece of it is that you have not, people aren't just there, but you've actually invited them in. You've tried to make them feel welcome, which is still separate from someone taking ownership and saying like, I feel like this is my place. Like I can be all that I can be in this place. And so belonging becomes the North Star, because we really want individuals to reach their potential, to take hold, step into leadership roles, mentor others, and make full contributions based upon their potential.
And so
The equity,
sorry, go ahead.
The equity piece is meant to reflect the fact that we don't all start in the same place. And that's, for a given individual, that is not that individual's fault, right? There's a whole history and there are generations on which they stand, which allows some people to be ahead educationally, to be ahead from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a base of knowledge. And the notion is that acknowledging equity means that we all have potential, but for some to realize their potential, they may be a little bit further ahead. And so we need to look back and say, if we really, particularly from an organizational standpoint, we benefit if we unleash the full potential, but some individuals may need additional assistance because they don't have as much as others did when they started.
This reminds me of what a gifted teacher you are, because you really helped me navigate these terms and these concepts. And the idea, and as I think of Johnson, I want us to have a diverse, inclusive community. I want people to be at that point of equity. And I really, really want people to feel that they belong. And thank you for delineating the differences. Now, you mentioned that sometimes some of these terms are charged, I think was the term that you used. And obviously, and a really key part of your job is to help people understand, to teach, to talk about this. I think to some extent to proselytize, for people to really understand the importance of this. So how do you go about talking about some of these issues with people who either are unfamiliar with the landscape, or maybe who have a sort of a flinch reaction? Like if they think someone says Black Lives Matter, what they're saying is that other lives don't matter. I mean, you'll have those kinds of reactions. How do you navigate that?
So I'll be honest, lots of deep breaths, because like my job is to help people along their journey. It's, I say to my colleagues, there's no question that you can't ask me. Now, there are questions that they shouldn't ask my other colleagues because it's not their job, but it is my job. And I take it really seriously, because I really think that this is about helping people to become more curious about others, to feel more comfortable about sharing their own journey and their own experiences, to build relationships, and also to move from, I'm a negotiations researcher and teacher at the core, to move from like what we think of as a fixed pie mentality, where we're just dividing up resources. And now there are these other people that we're being asked to bring to the table. And so, in a fixed pie mentality, you think that, well, therefore I'm going to get less. But to think more expansively about like, what are the resources that we're opening up and the opportunities, so that bringing more people in is seen as being an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for resources and for learning, and not something that others who are already there are giving up. So it means really asking a lot of questions, helping people to unpack assumptions. Sometimes it means interjecting levity, particularly if we're in a meeting. It's not always the appropriate way when someone says something that might be perceived as a microaggression to like call them out in that moment. Sometimes you can make a little bit of a joke and everyone laughs and the person recognizes it. Sometimes that's not appropriate. So sometimes it's just a look that conveys to everyone else that it wasn't okay, and then a circling back. So you have to have multiple tools in your toolkit. And be agile. There's a science to it, but there is also an art to it. I also say, because people will often say, like, how do you change people's attitudes, right? Like, how do you get them to believe in Black Lives Matter? And I'm actually not in the business of changing people's attitudes. I'm in the business of changing people's behaviors. And from an organizational standpoint, we have the ability to hold individuals in our communities accountable for their behaviors. And the hope is that we provide enough opportunities for them to grow and learn and not feel threatened and to feel safe so that they will engage and they will learn and they will take on their own journey and maybe seek help from me and others by asking questions. But it's the behavioral piece that I'm committed to, because as an organization, anyone that we invite into our space, we have a responsibility for making sure that they feel psychologically safe and that they feel that they can make meaningful contributions.
That makes a huge amount of sense. So we're in, you've been in two different spaces. You've been in academia, you've been in industry. And in both, really, you're helping to educate people, as you're saying. You're helping to educate future leaders. I'm more in the education space, but very much wanting to impact the industry space. When you're thinking about how we are collectively teaching people now, when you're thinking about how we're engaging with employees or students, what could we be doing differently? What could we be doing better to help people improve on these dimensions, to help people be the leaders that we need them to be? Yeah. Does anything stand out to you where you say, okay, so here's something that I think we should be thinking and stressing more about, or maybe handling a bit differently?
Yeah. So the first thing that I'll say is I am even more convinced of the importance of business school. The notion that an institution has as its goal to teach people how to be better managers and leaders so that information can be aggregated and distilled and leveraged and strategies can be formed and then executed upon is absolutely critical. When individuals aren't taught how to be good managers and aren't taught how to curate across the wide array of knowledge bases, then that's where you see bias coming in, preferential treatment, and the leaving of some people's expertise on the sideline that the organization doesn't get access to. So from a business school, from an educational standpoint, I think the most important thing is that we think in each of our disciplinary areas, like what are the ways that we need to invite people into conversations? What are the ways that we are leveraging groups and teams? And how can we teach people in those groups and teams while they're still in school to be better, to be curious, to bring people into the conversation, to assume that everyone there has something that they can learn from. Because if they build that muscle in a safe environment where we're all gonna fail, they'll be able to iterate on it and learn, because that's really the skill set that's needed. I mean, we send people out into the world and they're certainly smart and they're well trained in their base of knowledge, but the people who thrive and who make it through careers or even who are successful entrepreneurs are the ones who know how to leverage the value and the information and knowledge in other people. And the other people it's a diverse array. And what we know is that we often don't give people the feedback that they need to grow and develop. And particularly, and there's a concept called protective hesitation, which means that when someone is different from me, and particularly it can be along gender lines or along race and ethnic lines, the fear of how that other party is going to react, even when I'm giving them feedback that is very much needed, often keeps me from giving them feedback, which creates a lot of confusion. So the individual who should have been on the receiving end says, I was told everything is great, but I'm not getting promoted. I don't understand. When in fact, there are some developmental areas that are very real, but they haven't gotten that feedback. So it means we lose their potential and they become disheartened. And then they have to find another place that is willing to invest and willing to give them the feedback and willing to help them on their career trajectory. So I think recognizing that it doesn't just have to be a leadership and organizations topic, it shouldn't be. We work in teams in all the different disciplines. And so infusing more of that ethos across the board.
That's an absolute objective of of our strategy right now actually is making sure that from a curricular as well as a co-curricular aspect, we're weaving these issues and these priorities throughout our curriculum. So it's good to hear you say that, because certainly,
Well, and it's because it can't, like, the issues of diversity and belonging inclusion can't be they can't be the sideshow, because that's not how we confront them in the real world. And if we confront them in the real world and we haven't learned to recognize them in that context, then we can't evoke all the really important things that we're learning, that we've learned, because we don't know, oh, we're in the moment. This is go time. And so it really does need to be more integrated.
No, I agree. And the comfort level of conversation, of dialogue, of knowing that people recognize that you're trying to learn, and that you will make mistakes. I think that's one of the things that I've been so impressed with what Michelle and Jamie and our ODI colleagues have been doing is continually encouraging people to have these conversations and to give themselves and others a bit of grace while we're all navigating challenging times.
That's right. There are going to be mistakes made along the way.
Yeah, and let's practice, let's develop these muscles here, because as you're saying, they're going to need them when they're in their career as well. So
that's right. That's right.
That's key. So I could keep going, by the way, forever. I'm fascinated. I want to make sure, Jamie, I don't know where we are time-wise in terms of other questions coming in, but happy to keep going.
If you want to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Okay, super. Well, so let me bring in one other concept that's related to this, and that would be this idea of allyship. That's something that we've been working on, and actually one of the things I was pleased at is having allyship be something that we were weaving into our immersions at a point where people are drilling down on topics that obviously are near and dear to their hearts. So again, not a tack on, but something that's integral to what we're doing. But when you're thinking about allyship, and when you're thinking about teaching that skill and that priority, what jumps out as being particularly effective or useful? I mean, how would you see us being able to dial up allyship in our or any community?
Yeah, so there are multiple things. The first is so there's a researcher, a faculty member actually at Stern, Dolly Chugg, who's written a book called The Person You Mean to Be. And it's predicated on the notion that we all want to think of ourselves as being good, but really if we think of ourselves as being good-ish, then it means we're on a continual journey, right? We're going to make mistakes, we're going to try, we're going to have bad days where we didn't try, but we're good-ish and we're moving forward. And it's really a book about allyship, and she is very vulnerable in sharing some of her own sort of failings and learnings along the way. One of the things if you take that standpoint is that you need to recognize your ordinary privilege. And she talks about this. And the ordinary privilege are the things that, because it's like the air we breathe, we actually don't recognize that other people don't have it. And so, one of the things, so a couple of years ago, I had hip replacement surgery. And before I had hip replacement surgery, my walk and gait and, sort of moving around was deteriorating. And it wasn't until that point that I recognized like what my privilege was of being sort of able-bodied and the way that I had moved through the world and all the things that I could do, until I realized the things that I was now limited in doing. And so there are a host of ways in which we just don't see that privilege that other people are not experiencing. And this becomes really important as being an ally, because if you begin to interrogate the privileges that you have that maybe someone else doesn't, then you begin to see where your power is and how you can lend that privilege and that status in supporting others. Now, it's really important to understand that if you're in an ally role, that you want to understand how individuals who actually have that identity, what it is that they want to see happen to get their perspective, so that you're really in a support role as opposed to a jumping in front of them and seizing the conversation role of that. And then the other notion is of allyship. Sometimes we think we're an ally because we're not working against a particular thing, But actually, you're not an ally until you're working for it, until you're advocating, until you're making yourself a little bit uncomfortable and you're assuming some of the social risk because you don't know how others are going to think of you because you're now advocating for a group, you know, for which you don't have a primary identity. And so being an ally essentially is about stepping outside your comfort zone. And the more we practice it, the easier it gets to do it. And to think about, like, what are our privileges and how can we lend our privilege, our status to other individuals?
That's really, it's so insightful to put ourselves in the other person's position, think about the privilege we have that they don't, and not expect someone to ask for help, but to anticipate and support. So that's super helpful.
And we all have privilege. We all have privileges. It varies depending upon who we are, but we all have privileges. The last thing that I'll say about Dolly's work is that because she crystallized something that I had been informally and inarticulately discussing. And so this is this notion of, I've always said that there are, 20% roughly of the population who are they're dragging their feet. Maybe they're working against initiatives to advance diversity and belonging. There then are the 20% who are all in, I'm the Uber ally, give me more. And then there's the 60% that's, I think I want to be an ally. I need to learn more. I'm a little bit reticent. What Dolly says is that where we need to pitch our message is to the 60%. Right? We can support the ardent 20%, but the 60% are the ones where we have the greatest potential to pull people along, to give them education, to support, to give them grace when they have a misstep. And this shows up a lot on social media, that someone will say something awful, and the person thinking that they're being a good ally goes head to head with their Facebook friend, for example. When really what we need to do is to think about the response being pitched to the 60%, right? What do I need to say that I bring a few people along with me in this particular moment? And so that's something that just has stayed with me, and I've learned a great deal about in my journey of allyship.
And this particularly resonates in an election season. The pollers are sometimes guiding the conversation. So no, that's super helpful. Jamie, what about other questions? Anything to share?
Melissa, this question is for you. When a program is led by HR, how do you get the business to truly embrace the initiative, especially when it involves a sensitive topic such as race?
So I'm going to tread carefully here. So I report to the VP of Employee Experience, who is a very seasoned business professional. So she was the chief HR person at eBay for 10 years, but she was also a senior partner at McKinsey. And so she comes with with a truly business lens on it, now wrapped, in a HR package. And so I have the great fortune of reporting into her. But she's always taking the business perspective, and she understands that organizations and businesses do better when they have a broad array of individuals providing their experiences and their perspectives and their knowledge. So I've been the beneficiary of someone who understands HR and understands the importance of HR in unleashing the potential of employees in an organization, but is not limited by that because she has a business focus. And I think the message would be that I would invite more HR professionals to really think about what are the implications for business outcomes if you had more people who were equipped, who were recognized for their contributions, for their potential, and were equipped to truly make a difference. One of the things that came out of the report and then our subsequent diversity and belonging strategy is that my team, we have a business partner model. And the business partner model means that we go out and we support our talent partners, our HR professionals, helping them on their own growth journey, supporting and coaching them in the realm of diversity and belonging. so that they can be better supports to their leaders and managers. And if their leaders and managers can grow, then the employees that are in those domains are going to be on the receiving end and have an increasing sense of belonging. So HR is absolutely critical. But I think often business leaders and managers assume that HR is going to be the driver of diversity. And in many organizations, it actually isn't.
Thanks, Melissa. The next question is, thank you for joining us today, Melissa. My name is Chloe, and I'm a first year at Johnson and looking to pivot into HR, specifically within the D&I space. When thinking about the current state of unrest and reckoning in our country, how has your role and influence changed in organizations? Also, how have you seen your MBA skill set complement your work with D&I?
So I don't have an MBA, which is like, a little secret. But I do have a PhD from a business school. So, and my spouse is an MBA. And so all along the way, I always relied on him for tutorials to get me up to speed. So what I'll say is, thinking strategically, thinking about stakeholders and what their interests are and what they're trying to achieve is invaluable being in the diversity and inclusion space. I do think of myself as a negotiation professor, and I negotiate on a daily basis, not for the things that I think we typically think about, but like almost every group decision-making experience is a negotiation. There are people who come from different parts of the company, and I know that there's a certain set of outcomes that I want, but I can only get to it if the other individuals see the opportunity to advance the things that, the ways in which they are incented, the things that are on their roadmap. And so taking the perspective of others and then using that to frame what your asks are is incredibly important. And I think throughout business school, through case methodology and rigorous analysis, we're taught to take the perspective and understand what are those drivers. The other things that I will say is that this work is very data driven. It has to be. And particularly for those who are most skeptical, the data becomes the most convincing thing, putting empirical data in front of others. So a facility with data and analysis, we have a people analytics team that is dedicated to our employee experience operations. I work very closely with them, and through their very rigorous analyses and regressions, we're able to have a better understanding of what is happening across the company and with particular sets of individuals. The first portion of the question was, oh, I'm blanking now. Jamie, a reminder?
Yep. When thinking about the current state of unrest and reckoning in our country, how has your role or influence changed?
Yeah. So I would say that my friends and colleagues who do this work have become incredibly busy. Their dance cards are very full right now. The last couple of months have been incredibly hard because of what we've witnessed in a very public way. But for many of us, we knew that this was happening, and we had seen it happen to our family members and our friends. And so there's also a sadness that's associated with now there being recognition. But on the flip side, we've opened the aperture. There are more people who are committed to moving forward. There are more opportunities in our schools and in our organizations to take things forward. There are resources that are being put forth, and there are more conversations that are being had. And so I would say that I'm feeling incredibly optimistic, and I think others that are similarly situated are feeling that way. Although we have to take moments for ourselves because we have these roles, so we have to show up in a certain way. But we're also having personal experiences of what's happening in our larger world and society.
Thank you. Melissa, can you share the name of the book you referenced earlier?
Yes, it's The Person You Mean to Be by Professor Dolly Chugh. That's C-H-U-G-H. And she is an associate professor at NYU Stern School.
Perfect.
Can I pick up on something you'd said earlier? This is great. It's fun just being a spectator and hearing you talk. But when you were saying you're a negotiations researcher, and so you sort of see everything as having principles of negotiation. one of the things that I think is so powerful about business school is that there are these approaches, sometimes metaphors, that come out of a particular field, and you learn to apply them to everything else, right? So sometimes people might say, okay, well, if something's a negotiation, now it's time to negotiate. And you're saying, no. Every time I'm walking into a meeting, I'm thinking about that. I'm a nerdy accountant, right? But whenever anybody says, we really need to have some metrics here, and then we need to report that because that's going to create incentives for people to do. I think, yeah, go accounting. And the opportunity that you have in business school is you get exposed to all of those, and you're encouraged to integrate. And
That's right.
So I thank you for bringing that out. It's so important. And as you're saying, now more than ever, we're all as organizations and as leaders not siloing these issues. We're now recognizing that this is pervasive and that this is everyone's concern and everyone's priority. And
that's right. And it's going to take hard work. Like, we're going to have to be persistent. We're going to have to keep this front and center. And I think it's easy to get discouraged by how much effort it takes, but it's going to be worth it. It really is.
One more question. Out here in the working world, what are some actions we can take to be better allies within our organizations?
Yeah, so Mark and I talked a little bit about recognizing your ordinary privilege. I would say be curious, be willing to share yourself, form relationships or begin to form relationships with people that you might not otherwise think that you had things in common. It's really remarkable when you scratch beyond the surface, like where some of those commonalities and where bonds can form. Recognize that being an ally is about lending your privilege, lending your status, lending your voice, taking an active role. But for any given individual, that's going to take multiple forms. So for some people, it's going to be like protesting or organizing. And for other people, it's going to be quietly mentoring and supporting, sharing what you know, sharing opportunities that come up that someone else may not in their network and their realm of social capital may not come onto the radar. So it's really it's a journey of self-reflection, of understanding who you are and what you have to offer, and then offering it to a much broader array of individuals and groups than you might otherwise have done.
That's wonderful, wonderful advice. I just want to take this moment to thank you. Everyone listening in, you didn't see our short pre-meeting, but Melissa hopped on and we're all, sharing family stories. And she said something along the lines of, I feel like I'm coming home, or I feel like I'm coming home to family. And she is. And so to have you back with us, if only for this short time, and hopefully to have you feel the sense of belonging that I think you should feel. You're part of Johnson, you're part of Cornell forever. And to spend time sharing your wisdom with us and your time with us when you're so busy is just a real gift, and I'm tremendously appreciative. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I would do anything for all of you, and it's so good to really be back home. When I think of my formative years as an academic, I grew up at Cornell and at Johnson, and it was an incredibly generous place for my family. My kids walked the halls, and I kept them away from my negotiation students because my kids were really good negotiators and it made me look bad. But I'm so thrilled that I could spend time. And I also want to say this, at the time that I was on the faculty, having an office, an ODI office was not something that other business schools had. This was really leading edge. And so, Johnson and Cornell, the college, you've always been leading edge on these issues. And I just encourage you to continue to lean into it, because it's a place, it's who you are. And so that's why I was thrilled when I was there, and I'm delighted to be back with you today.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thanks again for joining us. And thanks everyone who tuned in today. And Jamie, thanks so much for hosting and being such a great moderator.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.